TGIF, everybody. The question of the day. Who is my best friend? Who is my best friend? I will explain in just a moment's time. Yesterday, phenomenal voting at the website, especially for a non-Ukraine survey question. I guess indirectly, maybe. 10,639 votes cast. Should Americans receive a $100 per month energy rebate in any month where the national average gas prices exceed $4 per gallon? 75.77% said no. The Wall Street Journal editorial I note today on this subject, I guess tethering where most of those voters are coming from, the word rebate is a misnomer because this isn't rebated from any payment to the federal government. It's a government check to pay for higher gas prices caused in large part by government, voters blaming Democratic policies for inflation and for making it harder to produce American oil and gas. With an election coming and their majority in peril, Democrats are resorting to what they do best, says the Wall Street Journal, spending more of your money. I guess the 75.77% who said no to yesterday's survey question agree with that mindset. Today's survey question, totally offbeat. We won't get to it until all the heavy lifting of the front page news, but I'm asking whether 9 to 5 will be the next work pillar to fall. Incredible story today. Incredible story and an incredible byline at the Washington Post. It's Woodward and Costa reunited. You know, sort of the elder Bob Woodward and the young Turk Robert Costa, who's now at CBS, and Woodward in this kind of semi-retired from the Post role. In other words, you don't see his byline, Bob Woodward, all that often in the Washington Post. And when you do, you know it's big. And this is big. Virginia Thomas urged White House chief to pursue unrelenting efforts to overturn the 2020 election, texts show. So here's the lead of the story. Virginia Thomas, a conservative activist married to Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, repeatedly pressed White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows to pursue unrelenting efforts to overturn the 2020 election in a series of urgent text messages in the critical weeks after the vote, according to copies of the messages obtained by the Washington Post and CBS News. Let me say at the outset, she's got a First Amendment right. And I always knew there's no surprise here that Clarence Thomas, conservative justice, is married to a very conservative woman in Ginni Thomas. We've known of her activism. What I didn't know and didn't appreciate is that she's also a conspiratorialist. The messages, 29 in all, reveal an extraordinary pipeline between Thomas, who goes by Ginni, and President Donald Trump's top aide during a period when Trump and his allies were vowing to go to the Supreme Court in an effort to negate the election results. Okay? So the Trump campaign, the president, are trying to get to the Supreme Court. They're trying to get to Clarence Thomas and 8 of his brethren. And Clarence Thomas's wife is very actively involved in trying to push the White House in a particular direction. Does it cross a line for Thomas? I'm going to get to that. I mean Clarence in a moment. It's certainly bad judgment on the part of his spouse. The messages don't directly reference Justice Thomas or the Supreme Court, but they show for the first time how Ginni Thomas used her access to Trump's inner circle to promote and seek and guide the president's strategy to overturn the election results, and how receptive and grateful Mark Meadows was. Among Thomas's stated goals in the messages was for lawyer Sidney Powell, totally discredited in the things that she advanced, who promoted incendiary and unsupported claims about the election, to be the lead and the face of the Trump legal team. How do we know all this? We know all this because these texts were among the 2,320 that Meadows provided to the House Select Committee investigating the January 6 attack. But then he stopped handing over that information. His lawyer has confirmed the existence of the messages between his client and Thomas and said that they do not present any legal issues. This is supposed to be just a portion. This is believed to be just a portion of Meadows' text messages, the point being that there might be more. Okay, now why do I say I knew she was conservative, I didn't know she was conspiratorial? Let me give you just one example. The first of the 29 messages from Ginni Thomas and Meadows was sent on November 5. So put this in context. This is 2 days after the election. She sends him a link to a YouTube video which is labeled Trump Sting with CIA Director Steve Pizzenik, the biggest election story in history, QFS blockchain. Pizzenik is a former State Department official, a far-right commentator who has falsely claimed that the 2012 massacre at Sandy Hook was a false flag operation to push gun control. Okay, so this is an Alex Jones-ish perspective that this guy believes, and it's his work that Ginni Thomas, the wife of Clarence Thomas, is sending to Mark Meadows. The video that Thomas shared with Meadows is no longer available on YouTube, but Thomas writes to Meadows, quote, "I hope this is true. Never heard anything like this before or even a hint of it. Is it possible? Watermarked ballots in over 12 states have been part of a huge Trump and military white hat sting operation in 12 key battleground states," she writes. So Ginni Thomas, 2 days after the election, writing to Mark Meadows, sharing information about watermarked ballots. Well, in exactly that time period, supporters of the QAnon extremist ideology were embracing a false theory that Trump had watermarked mail-in ballots so that he could track potential fraud. Quote, "Watch the water," was a refrain in QAnon circles at the time. Reminder, Clarence Thomas wrote in a dissent when the Supreme Court rejected election challenges that were filed by Trump and his allies that he believed it was baffling and inexplicable that the majority had declined against hearing these cases. Something else interesting, and this gets back to the first words that I said to you, who is my best friend? When Meadows wrote to Thomas on November 24, the White House Chief of Staff invoked God to describe the effort to overturn the election. Quote, now this is Mark Meadows, and this is like end of times stuff. This is a fight of good versus evil, Meadows wrote. Evil always looked like the victor until the King of Kings triumphs. Do not grow weary in well-doing. The fight continues. I have staked my career on it, well, at least my time in D.C. on it. That's Mark Meadows to the wife of Clarence Thomas. What does she say back? She says, "Thank you, exclamation, exclamation. Needed that, exclamation. This plus a conversation with my best friend just now. I will try to keep holding on. America is worth it." Who's the best friend? Is the best friend Clarence Thomas? Because, of course, that is now what inquiring minds want to know. And I suspect that today there will be a whole, litany of incidents where Ginni Thomas has referred to Clarence Thomas as her best friend. And I know many of you are going to say, well, that's not all that unusual. Michael, don't you regard your spouse as your best friend? Still, in this context, it takes on added significance. I note that Jeffrey Toobin in 2011 for The New Yorker had a profile of Clarence Thomas. Quote, Thomas continued, "There's a difference between being poor and being stupid, and you're stupid for thinking that they're stupid. As my granddaddy would say, you're just an educated fool, blah, 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 blah." Thomas saw that he was getting worked up and he paused with a small laugh. "My wife does this too," he said. "My wife is my best friend." I know there are other instances out there that have already been assembled by the media. Ginni Thomas, again, has a First Amendment right to express her opinions. But the question that will now be raised is whether Clarence Thomas can sit on any case remotely that involves the election or the election to come. I see that Stephen Gillers, who's an NYU law professor and judicial ethics expert, has already weighed in and said he must recuse himself and should have recused himself in the cases that have been heard up until now. So go to Smerconish.com, All the links that I'm referencing contained in our headlines of the day and the newsletter. Domestically, that's the big political story. Of course, the president is overseas meeting with NATO allies. The ABC News story is one that I linked to. President Biden took questions at a news conference at NATO headquarters yesterday, addressing warnings of possible chemical weapons attacks by Russia. It was the very first question that he was asked, whether the U.S. had gathered specific intelligence that suggests Russian President Putin is considering deploying chemical weapons, and whether the U.S. or NATO would respond with military action if he did use them. President Biden, in response, said, I'm not going to give you intelligence data. But number two, we would respond. We would respond if he uses it. And the nature of the response would depend on the nature of the use. It would trigger a response in kind. Whether you're asking or not, you're asking whether NATO would cross, we'd make a decision at that time. I also take note of the fact that I've spoken here extensively about how every time we have a Ukraine survey question and there's a more militaristic option that I offer, those who respond at my website go with that response by large numbers. And then I tell you, hey, my survey questions are interesting. They're good fodder for conversation, but they're not necessarily scientific. Not necessarily. They're not scientific. But other pollsters, do involve political science and make sure that their sample size is representative of society at large, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I see that the Associated Press has a story, which I also linked to today. Americans want Biden to be tougher on Russia. This is an AP NORC survey. 56% of Americans think Biden has not been tough enough on Russia, while 36% say that his approach has been about right. And he's not really sustained a bump in his own numbers, President Biden. But I thought it was interesting that a majority say they want him to be tougher. Something else of interest today relative to Ukraine and Russia. It's a Julian Barnes piece in the New York Times about who fights, why the U.S. was wrong about Ukraine and the Afghan war. This is really interesting, and I'm sure because anytime there's a comparison about our response in Ukraine versus other nations, including Afghanistan, some read race or racism into it. Why are we so involved? Why are we so supportive of Ukraine more so than we were of other nations? Does it have to do with the race, pigmentation of the skin, the Ukrainians versus some third world nation? So Julian Barnes has a really interesting comparison today about how Ukrainian citizens learned to make Molotov cocktails from government public service announcements and then recorded themselves setting Russian armored vehicles on fire. Ukraine's soldiers waited in ambush, fired Western-provided missiles at Russian tanks. The country's president recorded messages from the streets of his capital urging his country to fight back against the invaders. And then, says the Times, Julian Barnes, it was a stark contrast from a different set of images just 7 months ago when the Taliban rolled into Afghanistan's capital. They were unopposed. Most Afghan troops abandoned their uniforms and their weapons. The president fled to the United Arab Emirates, leaving his country to the Taliban militants it had fought for some 2 decades. Really fascinating question. Why in Ukraine are they standing and fighting? Why in Afghanistan did they totally capitulate? And read the piece. It's in the website. It's in the newsletter today. But essentially they say, you just don't know. Intelligence just doesn't know. For example, 2 weeks before the invasion, Senator Angus King asked intel officials about Zelensky and how he's going to handle the impending Russian invasion. King had argued that had President Ashraf Ghani of Afghanistan not fled, in the face of an advancing enemy force, Kabul might have lasted longer. And he wanted to know, what about this guy Zelensky? What's he going to do? Will he be Churchill or Ghani? The officials, the intel officials who were briefing Senator King, said that Zelensky had publicly played down the likelihood of invasion. Wow, remember that? That's true. And they simply did not know how he would respond. They did not know. So there's not a clear answer to it, but it's a pretty interesting and provocative issue to analyze. And remember that survey question about 10 days ago that I read here where Americans were asked, would you stay and fight if you were in the same position as Ukraine? And there was a difference as between R's, D's, and I's. And I said at the time, and some other pundits, observers had said at the time, it's an interesting question, but you really don't know. You don't know whether you're fight or flight until you're in that sorry position. President also warning, and I had this from yahoo.com, today at smerconish.com, about food shortages. The president said that the world will experience food shortages as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and production increases, subject of discussions now at the Group of Seven meeting that took place yesterday. My God, how much more can we sustain? I mean, a pandemic, war, we've got climate change, now a food shortage. I would like us to get back to the days where we were arguing about, domestic politics and abortion or the size of the social safety net. Interesting story and follow-up about Judge Jackson. No hiccups of any significance in the road for her nomination process. Jeff Greenfield writing at Politico today, sounding very much like what I've told you for the last 3 days. He said this: judging Cruz and company misses the point. He's talking about Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and a number of the other, Marsha Blackburn, a number of the other Republicans in the way in which they've questioned Judge Jackson. Says Jeff Greenfield, this was not a group of senators engaging in skeptical or serious questioning of a Supreme Court nominee. This was a trio of presidential candidates appealing to the base that will choose the next Republican White House nominee. And from that perspective, the trio accomplished what they set out to do. More broadly, these efforts fit perfectly into an approach that has rewarded the GOP for more than half a century, peeling away traditional Democrats, voters with the twin factors of race and crime. Here's another part of the Judge Ketanji Jackson nomination process. Remember how Ted Cruz interrogated her about critical race theory and the books that were used as part of the curriculum at Georgetown Day School, where she's on the board? Now, reporters are taking a look at, I think it's called St. John's, which is a prestigious school in Texas, Dallas area, where the Cruz daughters are educated. Some of the same books and some of the same language. SCOTUS news today, I think more interesting than the last 24 hours about Judge Jackson, because there really hasn't been much of anything significant, is another Supreme Court story. You'll find it in my website today and in the newsletter from SCOTUS blog. Amy Howe wrote it. Headline: Court bars Texas from executing inmate unless it allows pastor's touch and audible prayer. So in this particular case, a guy is about to be executed by lethal injection. And he wants to have his, think about this now, he wants to have his pastor's hands on him and audible prayer taking place as he's dying. And the question is, should he be entitled to that request? Like normally we're talking about the last meal request. Well, the Supreme Court ruled yesterday that the man on death row in Texas can have his pastor touch and pray out loud while he's being executed. It's a case called Ramirez versus Collier, the latest chapter in the nearly 3-year-long dispute over the presence of spiritual advisors at executions, and the justices appeared, says Amy Howe, to express some frustration that the case was before them at all. John Ramirez is the inmate, sentenced to die for the 2004 murder of a convenience store clerk named Pablo Castro. With his execution date approaching last year, Ramirez requested that his pastor be allowed to place his hand on him and audibly pray in the execution chamber while Ramirez is given a lethal injection. Ramirez argued that the pastor's spiritual comfort in the final months of Ramirez's life is fundamental to his religious beliefs. Texas rejected his request. You wonder why? I wondered why. They cited security concerns and argued that he made the request too late. So this has gone on for a while, and finally the Supreme Court says yesterday, why are we even here? Why are we even arguing? The guy wants to have his pastor there as he's dying. Let him have it. Trump v. Clinton. Trump v. Clinton. You might think that I'm making reference to the 2016 election. No, I'm making reference to a lawsuit that Donald Trump just filed against Hillary Clinton. You know, Trump usually threatens and doesn't follow through on the threats. This time he did. How come? Well, let me tell you what it's about, first of all. Yesterday, he filed a sprawling civil lawsuit against 2016 Democratic presidential nominee Hillary Clinton, the DNC, Jake Sullivan, now the White House National Security Advisor, and more than a dozen others, alleging a vast conspiracy to undermine his 2016 presidential campaign and administration with accusations of Russian collusion. Why would Trump do this? It's not the $24 million that he's seeking, because he's not going to get $24 million. He's not going to get any money. But why would he do this? Here's my theory. My theory is that, first of all, anytime that you're going after Hillary Clinton and your name is Donald Trump, that's a good thing politically. Like taking her on in a court of law or in an election, I'm sure will be, I'll bet you today that there are emails being sent out by his PAC that are talking about his fight against Hillary and can you help me? Can you help me litigate against Hillary Clinton? So number one, it's good for the base. It salves the base. It'll be a good fundraising vehicle. Secondly, I think probably that he hopes through the discovery process, he can create a number of headlines following up today's headline that he's taking her on. And maybe they'll find some things that they can then use for political purposes going into the next presidential election. That's the upside. It's not financial. It's political. Planes, trains, and automobiles. There's a CBS News story that you should know about today where the airlines have asked the Biden administration to drop the mask mandate and the testing requirements for travelers. I don't know about you, but those that I see on a day-to-day basis now wearing masks are in the distinct minority, and I'm in some bluish areas, especially this week, where you'd expect to see a lot of masks, but they're few and far between. I think it makes sense. The CEOs of the nation's largest airlines asking the Biden administration to drop the federal mask mandate on airplanes, along with the pre-departure testing requirement for international travelers. It's like the last area. I flew across country this week. So I'm the type, I'm not there 2 hours in advance, but I am there 90 minutes in advance. So from the moment you walk into the terminal, you're masked up. Then for a flight of that duration, 6 hours, 5 going back, plus when you go to your flight on the way back and you've got to be in the terminal wearing it again, I hope they're successful. The CDC earlier this month extended the mass transit mandate for 30 days until mid-April. That's where that stands. Speaking of transportation, Uber defeated the cab. Uber defeated the conventional world of taxis. And I was happy with that because taxis, at least in my hometown of Philadelphia, there's never enough room in the back seat, and the cleanliness is always at issue. Well, if you can't beat them, join them. New York City residents will soon be able to order a yellow cab through Uber. So you know how you go on Uber and now you've got a choice of, do you want a black car? Do you want an SUV? Do you want somebody to pick you up in their car, Uber X, et cetera, et cetera? Now you're going to have a taxi option. So if you want to ride in a taxi for less than you would ride, I guess, in an SUV or a black car, probably comparable to Uber X, you'll have that option, which I think is pretty cool. Maybe that's a good resolution for Uber and for taxi. There's so much good stuff out today. All right, I'll mention one more, and then I'll take a break and open the telephone lines and include your calls. There's a story from the San Francisco Chronicle today that caught my eye about the world of polarization, always a favorite subject of mine to get into. It has now spread to novelty products. And it's amazing because internet entrepreneurs far from the U.S., remember the line about, guys in Macedonia who were manipulating the 2016 presidential election? Apparently there are now overseas interests capitalizing on the partisan divide in the United States. Here's what it says. The Chronicle uncovered an extraordinary new set of players in the battle. Internet entrepreneurs developing countries who take advantage of Western political division and inflame it with the sole aim of juicing sales of customized T-shirts, mugs, tumblers, ball caps, tote bags, pillows, and phone cases with the profits shared by American companies. I never did the, the angry is over t-shirt. But I assure you that if I were selling my angry is over t-shirt that I envisioned, I wouldn't match the sales of those who are stirring the pot and instead trying to accentuate the partisan divide. It's the same with the world of talk and cable. The money lies when you stoke people up. And I'm like fighting a losing upstream battle when I'm trying to market the idea of angry being over, when I'm outgunned and outmatched by those forces that are saying, hey, let's make people even angrier. Remember Frances Haugen, the whistleblower from Facebook, talking about the algorithms and how they tweaked them to keep people engaged through anger? Now they're not Facebook, but now those same type of interests are selling T-shirts and coffee mugs based on it. My goodness, on a Friday, that's a hell of a lot, isn't it? Yeah. Call me. I'm at 855-4...